has he killed before? I don't think he has. I think he has planned this a long time.
Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
What's up, STS Nation, and welcome back. It has been 7 weeks and 2 days, and now Moscow PD, the Idaho State Police, and the FBI believe that they have their killer, 28-year-old Brian Kohberger. Still no murder weapon. We'll discuss why that might be. We deliver the best guests in true crime, and tonight's panel, you don't need to look any further. Perhaps the most powerful trio when it comes to investigative work and the psychology of killers. They are here to talk about some of the latest developments. First off, we just want to make it clear that Brian Kohberger is only a suspect, presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, and that the profile that both Anne and Dr. Brucato spoke about on the previous episode that they provided was just part of a discussion, also what they will discuss today, and had nothing to do whatsoever with Brian Kohberger's arrest. A little bit about Anne, a legend in the mind hunting business. Anne Wolbert Burgess is an internationally recognized pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse, and the author of A Killer by Design, Murders, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. Among her many awards and accolades in 2016, she was named a living legend by the American Academy of Nursing. You know the super successful Netflix show Mindhunters about the FBI's first day of criminal profiling. Well, Anne worked with those real-life agents that show is based on. Dr. Gary Brucato, Ph.D., is presently a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess and Victor Petreka on forensic research. They've examined crimes such as murder, including serial killing, sex offenses, mutilation and dismemberment, and the insanity defense. He's currently serving as a consultant on a grant funded by both Ann and Mr. Petreka, analyzing murders involving asphyxiation by strangulation and other means. Gary studied, among other things, as you might well guess, how violent thoughts and actions emerge in psychotic versus non-psychotic persons, which we'll talk about. He is the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. And then you've got Jeff Wood, the man who looks like a retired FBI special agent, is a retired FBI special agent out of Boston, where he focused on gangs and gang violence and is a seasoned investigator. Quick housekeeping notes. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Patreon. As my daughter says, hit that subscribe button and the like button. It helps with the algorithm. And some programming notes. Wednesday morning, we have Barbara Ray Venter. Google her. She helped break open the Golden State Killer case and is a world-renowned expert in genealogical DNA. Gary is shaking his head because he has heard of her. And then the next morning, we have Kerry Ralston, the daughter of Dennis Rader, otherwise known as the BTK serial killer. So some impressive guests. No one more impressive than Ann Burgess. Before we start, once again, let's remember the victims' names who were lost way too soon. Madison Mogan, 21, Kaylee Gonzalez, 21, Zana Kernodal, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20. And Jeff, to you first, it seems like we're on a road to justice here for these victims. There will be a court appearance later today in Pennsylvania, Monroe County. What do you think we can expect in a court hearing?
Well, first of all, you have to remember that the arrest based in Pennsylvania was based on what the FBI calls, or the federal government calls, the unlawful flight to avoid prosecution warrant. Basically, it enables the FBI, U.S. Marshals to effect an arrest on a suspect out of state. So in this case, the murder took place in Idaho. They have a suspect. He's now in Pennsylvania. The FBI can't make an arrest on those state murder charges and that breaking and entering charge without the UFAP. That's a federal warrant. Once he agrees to be extradited, which we're hearing from the news he'll do, he'll be extradited and that charge will be dismissed because he's in custody. And then once he arrives in Idaho, and everything from the news is telling us he will be in front of the judge most likely by Wednesday. Come Wednesday morning, he'll have, I don't know what Idaho calls it. In the federal government, we call it our initial appearance. He's brought in front of the judge. His charges will be read to him. His maximum sentence for each charge will be read to him, and he'll then enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. In every instance that I'm aware of, everyone pleads not guilty at that time frame. We will then be able to get the probable cause warrant, or the affidavit that was used to obtain that arrest will be released at that point.
And now we know some bits of information that have come out through the media. For example, that he was apparently stalking his victims, which we'll talk about. That he drove back with his father. That he was in possession of this now 2015 Hyundai Elantra, even though the Bolo was for 2011 to 2013. But the question to you: why do we not know more at this point? Are we waiting on that sealed affidavit?
Yes. When you're conducting an investigation, law enforcement entities can't comment on their ongoing investigations. They can go and seek help. They can go and provide information that will help them say, hey, we need help. We need tips, right? In this case, hey, we're looking for this car. But they're not releasing other information. Why? Because they have to hold that information close to the vest, which, of course, in today's day and age in America, we want everything now. We want it. We want it. We want it. They can't give it. So once you have court proceedings, that information becomes public. So the only information that will come out on Wednesday will be contained in that affidavit that said, here's our probable cause of why we want to arrest this suspect. That will come out. In the indictment, they may add more information, and once the indictment is done and he's brought back in for another hearing, the indictment will be unsealed and we'll get even more information on why he has been or what the evidence that they have against him. And we'll continue every time there's something else that will be made public, and then we'll get the information.
But I just want to underscore again that Brian Kohberger is presumed innocent until proven guilty by a court of law. With that, to you, Ann and Gary, Ann in particular, you've seen it pretty much all in your career, which has spanned many decades. What, if anything, surprised you about this arrest?
What surprised me about this arrest was really how, although people didn't think it was fast. In other words, once they got whatever the information is that's going to be released, they really moved pretty quickly. Again, from public information, the FBI or the investigators were watching him for several days before they went in. And I will say what surprised me in another way is, and I was very happy to see, is they arrested him at 3:00 in the morning, if I'm correct. And that was about the same time that he was, if he's as a suspect, if he had committed the crime. So he was woken up similarly as they were. So I thought that, I don't know whether that was by design, but I thought that was that was a surprise.
That's an interesting tidbit there. Inconveniencing him for a horrific crime. Gary, to you, you studied this extensively. What, if anything, surprised you when you got the news that this person was arrested?
Well, I was very struck by how well the profile that we had sketched out in our previous appearance matched at least the suspect in this case. And consequently, I was surprised by how quickly he was apprehended, because the mistakes that seem to have been made, if this is indeed the killer, had an almost amateurish quality to them. You would think that somebody with this degree of ego and driven by that kind of desire, and with the kind of training that it appears this individual had, that he wouldn't have been apprehended so easily, retaining the car, for example, and things like that. And I think what it really speaks to, if this is indeed the killer, is that sometimes the ego can get so colossal that it can make a person underestimate the abilities of other people to catch you. And we had said, as part of the profile that we patched together, that for this type of individual, it's ego that causes the offense and it's ego that captures you. So I think, as I say, if this suspect is guilty, there is something kind of poetic about that being what brings the person down.
Jeff, back to you for a minute, and Gary, I'll have you mute again. Haley Gonzalez's dad just came out and publicly said that they are looking for connections between Brian Kohberger and the victims. Police also say that they want more tips on this alleged killer. And Kaylee's father went on to say that he will be in court in Idaho to, quote unquote, look him in the face and let him know this is not going away anytime soon. From an investigator standpoint, is this what you'd expect, that they're looking for connections still? Parent is obviously very upset, wants to confront this individual in the courtroom.
Absolutely. In these kind of investigations, you keep going because you want to be able to present more. You want to pile on evidence to show we have arrested the right person, so you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And in some cases that I've participated in, once we have the evidence, we're good to go. But in other cases, when we're going here where it's murder, right? They have enough to say we have probable cause to arrest this person for these charges. But they're going to want to prove a lot more than just what they have. They want to show, something came out in the news either yesterday or today, how it looks like he's been stalking the victims for several weeks. Well, I know how they've been able to do that, or how they were able to show that, but they want more than just, hey, we can show these steps of how we've determined he was stalking them or watching them. But they want more. They're going to go back and say, hey, did they interact in person? Or was it, what caused him to focus in on these people? If it's all of them, or if it was one and then the others are victims by being in the same location as the person he was targeting. But they want to paint a complete picture. They don't want to leave blanks that a defense attorney will try and poke holes in and raise that to, you haven't proved beyond a reasonable doubt. We have reasonable doubt here. So they want to bring it in and paint the entire picture so they can knock out any type of defense that a defense attorney could possibly come up with.
And of course, a prosecution is the ultimate, win for the state, which is what they're going for. And back to you, and we'll start to get into the psychology of all this. Upon his arrest, it was reported that he asked law enforcement, and I quote here, "Has anyone else been arrested?" The public defender representing him right now went on to say that meaning that Brian Kohberger is, quote, a little bit shocked by the accusation. Are you expecting any sort of gamesmanship from him? Is this an innocent question, if there's anything such as innocence with this person, or is he already poised for some sort of cat and mouse game with law enforcement, in your opinion?
In my opinion, I'd agree with the latter. I think that in what we've seen and what has come out, what we'll get to, is he really is a manipulator and has prepared. If he has prepared as well as stalking the victims and knowing and planning and so forth, this was planned. What he would say if arrested, I would. That would be my opinion, that this is something that he's going to try to take control, if he can, of the and try to, obviously I think he's going to plead not guilty and try to get away with it, try to get away with the murder.
And that's why this genealogical DNA is so important, why we're having Barbara Venter on our program tomorrow, who is sort of the queen of genealogical DNA. Gary, to you, same question. He asked police, has anyone else been arrested? Are you expecting gamesmanship on his part?
Well, if the individual that's in custody is the offender, the pattern would suggest an individual who was highly motivated by an egotistical need to control and manipulate people, and I would expect that behavior to play out pervasively across everything we see, from the moment of arrest through the courtroom, and perhaps even if there's a conviction, even during the time of incarceration. I think what you'll see is an individual who would at first be controlling the game, first by resisting, throwing red herrings, so forth, who probably was doing so even before arrest by posting things on the internet to throw people off, manipulate people, boast behind the curtain, and who would probably eventually be someone who loved to talk about himself to people who contacted him and wanted details. As I have been saying a couple of times that I've been appearing about this, one of the things that makes me so hesitant to speak about this offender is I feel that every time we do so, we add to his already colossal ego. And I think it's important to step back and ask ourselves, what is so interesting about this person? Why are we talking about him so much? Why is the whole nation mesmerized by him? In many ways, is he not a garden variety killer who didn't do anything that was particularly unusual? But I think there's something about him that at the level of personality that has a way of sucking people in and forcing them to admire him or talk about him or find him mesmerizing or confusing. And I think that's what you're seeing, somebody who's just adding to that narrative constantly. What did he mean by this little comment, and so forth. So he probably was just trying to throw off.
Gary, why are we so intrigued by all of this?
Well, I think it's an interesting question to open up to the group. But it's, I suppose there must be something about this offense that we can identify with, or perhaps the public really enjoys a good kind of cat and mouse game, and they forget that these are real human beings. This is not an episode of CSI or something. And I suppose to a certain extent, the public might be drawn to the neatness of these kinds of stories, the puzzle of solving them, the justice and all that. But I think it's important to step back and realize, that this guy was probably a nobody who came along and decided to take some lives of innocent and promising people. And for some reason, we hover on him. And I think it is an interesting question to open up to everyone.
So, Anne, why are we so fascinated? You're the world expert on this. What is your thought?
Well, in addition to what Gary said, it's something that people can identify with. We all go to bed every night and go to sleep, and we all think we're going to wake up in the morning. And this was a horrific crime in which the victims had very little, if any, ability to defend themselves. And so when you think of victimization, I find many people will say either they can identify with the victim or they can't. In this case, I think we identify with 4 victims. It isn't just one. And so if you're not safe in your own bed sleeping, when you think, I don't know, that where are you ever safe? So that type of, as people listen to it, I think they listen in a way of how can I prevent this ever happening, which is, of course, what from a victimization standpoint, we want to do all we can to help people prevent. And how do you prevent someone from waking you up and killing you?
And I think that is a base concern from humanity, is that we want to be safe. And if we're not safe in our own bedrooms, that is problematic. Jeff, you're a retired FBI special agent. I've had other law enforcement officials on. Situational awareness is extremely important. Just as a matter of public service right now, what are some easy things people can do to keep themselves safe? Obviously, when you're in your bedroom, you expect to be safe, but just going to a mall or going to a restaurant, any quick tips you can offer to help keep people safe?
Well, I would say 1, lock your door. And that's for your house, right? Lock your doors. I think one thing that we never really touched on the first time we met, but they hosted a party that no one in the house was at. and that tells me that you've now raised when we talk about victimology, you're either low risk or high risk. To me, they were no longer at a low risk because they have people they don't know who are in their house having a party and they're not present. So if you're going to host a party, you're going to let a party happen, you need to be there so you're aware of who is in your house. When you go out, today you see so many kids and people who are on their phones and they have no situational awareness. So when you're in areas now, you get off your phone. When you're walking from your car to a restaurant or you're walking along the street, put your phone away and just watch what's going on around you. That will be huge. Criminals, bad people who intend to do harm, look for easy targets. If something looks harder, they're going to go for what's easier because they're going to think that their success rate's higher. So just the act of looking around makes somebody think, wait, they may have seen me. Now they're looking at me. I'm going to pick on somebody else who's not paying attention, whose head is in the phone, right? So those are steps we can take to defend ourselves. Back in the day when I was in different training, here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. I believe it was I think it was in Greece. Some terrorists were looking to kidnap some people. They did. When the victims were recovered, everyone was found safe, but they found notes, and an American naval officer who was at the embassy, they had been surveilling him to kidnap him, and in their notes they said, "Oh, he's too surveillance oriented." And they went and approached him and said, "What did you do?" And he goes, "Well, in the morning I come out and I look at my car to see which new dings are, as people are driving down, were in my car. They thought they were looking for a bomb or something on the car. I'd also look it up and down the street because I was looking for my garbage can because it'd always get hit or no one ever returned it to where it was." But that was enough to make people think that he was actually looking for people conducting surveillance on him, and it saved him from becoming a victim. So that's what we need to do in our daily lives when we're out on the streets.
Interesting. Speaking of surveillance, there are reports that the suspect, Brian Kohberger, was being surveilled for about 4 days by law enforcement, presumably also members of the FBI. If you can just kind of pull back the curtain, what were they doing at that time? Just strictly watching him, trying to grab his DNA? What do you do during that period of time as an investigator?
Well, you're looking at their life, the life and the day of in this case the suspect, right? They want to know what time is he up, what time is he moving around, what's he do? Does he develop a pattern, which will make it easier for the time when it comes to arrest. And two, yes, we're looking. Obviously, what we're hearing on the news is they recovered DNA. He's never been arrested, so his DNA is not in any database. But they probably took the DNA and they were able to say, oh, wait, here's DNA related to a family, and now they've gotten names. Then they said, oh, we're looking for a car. They can find out, oh, he's got a white Elantra registered in his name. Right. So now that narrows it in. Now they're looking for, how do we get DNA from him? And, just takes one mistake. Okay. Maybe he's drinking from a bottle of water, throws the bottle away. They'll pick the bottle up. They can say, we saw him throw it away. We got the bottle. They compare the DNA on the bottle. It's his because they saw it was his. And now it's a match to the DNA that they found at the crime scene. If that's what they have, that's a guess, but that's my take on what's happened, because I've seen cases made against criminals just in the way I've described it.
And don't you worry, STS Nation. I got your questions, and we're going to leave plenty of time because I know you want to ask both Ann and Dr. Brucato plenty of them, and we'll get to them. And they've agreed to stick around to answer them. But to you, Gary, it's interesting. You mentioned a garden variety killer and not much more than that. Maybe with the caveat that he was studying criminal justice at a pretty high level, entering as you did into a PhD program. You finished yours. He was in his first year here. Did that surprise you in any manner, Gary?
Well, one of the things we had said as we appeared in various places talking about the profile was that it was very clear this is an individual. This was an individual who had studied previous crimes in some capacity, and that he was an intelligent person who was not impulsive, was kind of methodical, and had clearly thought out this entire process. So that part, in terms of having studied and all that, was not surprising at all. There is something kind of perverse about discovering that this is a person who was interested in possibly pursuing a career like our own. And I think what it really speaks to is that if you were to take somebody with the skill set that we had and treat us terribly and kind of break us down and make us angry and antisocial, Lord knows what we would do with that skill set. Fortunately, we happen to be people who chose to do a pro-social thing in this world. But the idea is, if you think about it, the difference between a person who is predatory in this way and somebody who chooses a pro-social career is really the way you turn those gifts, what you use them for. And I think that what really made or broke this guy moving in the negative direction was that he simply couldn't find any place at all that he found predictable and kind of safe and felt that people cared about him. The reality is that if this offender is the guy that is under arrest, this is somebody who, as we had said, lived a very mechanical kind of existence, and I think tried to reduce the world to a science, and found that everything he tried was not adequate. If I lose weight, will people like me? If I'm a little more aggressive, will people like me? If I assert myself, will they like me? If I study and become intelligent and succeed, will they like me? And he just kept repeatedly failing, and I think ultimately became convinced that the only way to understand people was to reduce them to a kind of a science and try to first study them meticulously and then manipulate them to try to learn how to reduce. I think that's why it's one of the interesting things about this suspect is that he's vegan, and the sparing of the dog interested me and all that. And I have to say, after contemplating it a while, I think he found animals to be so much more predictable than human beings that he preferred them. Because I think the whole point is that human beings perplex him because they don't make any sense, despite all of his studies. And I think also that animals aren't really capable of the inventive cruelty that human beings are. So that I'm interested in his attitude towards animals and all that. Although I do believe he's probably killed some of them, and there is a great irony in being a vegan who may have killed 4 people. That's also a fascinating question, but I think it has something to do with being the one who arbitrates who gets to live or die, and have control over that. But I think those are the thoughts that kind of come into mind as I'm thinking about this at this time.
A quick follow-up there, Gary. So we like to label people in our society. Is he definable yet? Is he a mass killer? Would he have been on his way to being a serial killer? How do you define him at this point?
Well, if this individual had gone on to kill, let's say, a few days after this mass murder, we might think of him as what's called a spree killer, just somebody that doesn't really have a cooling off period and has now killed in 2 separate locations. But if he were not captured and a month had gone by and he killed again, he would be entering into serial killer territory. Now, I have to tell you, I have a kind of a little difficulty with the most current definition of serial killer, because the current definition only requires 2 victims separated in time by a cooling off period, and that's it. There's no mention of the motive, so that somebody who knocks over a bank and kills a guard and then 3 months later kills somebody in a deli during the course of a robbery is a serial killer. But in the original conceptualization of serial killer, the idea was more that what you did, we needed 3 victims, and it required doing what you did in the service of what was called abnormal psychological gratification. And I think that's a very important point, because one of the things that's going to make establishing motives so difficult in this case, what I think is really going to confuse people in the jury and all that, is that we all want to grope for a more human, understandable motive. Like maybe this was a jealous person, maybe this was a person, who had some practical aim or something like that. And you saw that in the kinds of people that were being suspected by the general public when they were kind of projecting their fantasies into this crime. Where you have to go, and this is where people who do work like Anne and myself, it's hard to do. You really have to go in your mind to the very perverse place that somebody who commits these kinds of offenses would go for motive. And for people like that, motive can be something like playing out fantasies of domination or control or manipulation that you've had for many years towards a victim who symbolizes the people who've hurt you, whether that's women or authority figures or some other group. And another possible motive is simply being someone who is so mechanical and so detached and so confused about human relationships, so desires to reduce them to a science, that the stimulation has to do with asserting manipulation by reducing people to an experiment or a science or something like that, so that you can actually have a killer who is simply interested in the experience of killing or the notoriety that comes with it, or going from a nothing to an everybody. And I think it's very difficult for people in the general population to really get that. We might have felt slighted, we might have felt envious, we might have felt alone, but the idea that one would, in the cool light of reason, sit back and play out a fantasy like that, probably after weeks, if not months, of planning, requires going to a very dark place in the mind. So the answer is, if that's true, that this is somebody who, in this kind of reptilian way, did that, that is not really characteristic of somebody who's going to just stay a mass murderer. Mass murder, as an authority on the subject, I told you last time I had been the first author on the largest ever study of mass murder when I was at Columbia Medical Center, alongside Dr. Raghi Gurgis, and we found that the vast majority of mass murders are kind of they're committed by people who are kind of impulsive and upset, emotionally overwhelmed. There's been something that's been taken from them, and they have no coping skills. It's a small subset of them that are more methodical and grudge holding, and about 11.78% of mass murderers prove to be serial killers. It's not much. But where you have this kind of methodical plotting and this kind of apparent motivation, that's somebody that isn't necessarily going to be sated by committing one offense like this, and I think would not have been satisfied by some of the mistakes and the lack of control, and having anticipated being able to control 4 people, possibly even 6 people, and not done it to satisfaction. And I would be very concerned that if that person had not been apprehended, they would be at risk of going on to kill again. I'd be very curious to hear if Anne agrees with that, but I think that this was an individual who looks to be motivated by the kinds of things that serial killers are motivated by.
And I'll have you add to that right on cue. And also, do you think he has killed before? And if not human beings, has he killed animals? Or was that reported about as skinned dogs? So just if you could add to motive and whether he's killed before.
Well, I would agree with what Gary has said, but then to add to it in terms of has he killed before, I don't think he has. I think he has planned this a long time. He has an education that can follow it, a little bit sketchy there, so there might have been, but some of those sketchy things I think are going to be filled in. There might have been some mental health issues or some drug issues to explain that, and as I think we will find out more as time goes on. But would he kill again? Yes, I had no reservation in saying I think he would, but I think he is as interested in how this goes now, that this will consume a lot of him. I think he has thought about what if I got caught, even though I think he wanted the perfect murder, and maybe to some degree that certainly there's been a bump in the thinking there, but he is, I think, he would be at risk, although it has been 7 weeks and nothing more. He has to kill 4 people. He certainly has enough to think about and to watch people. And I think a lot of what we'll find out is he has been at places. We understand that he did go to class where it was discussed afterwards. So he had placed himself in areas where it would be discussed. And I think that is important from a motive standpoint of what is operating to keep him and to have planned it. To plan it, I would want to go back and find out some earlier experiences, because it always says, yes, people can have early experiences that they then kind of focus on, but why murder? Why that type of not acting out, but of planning? So I really look forward, if he is the one, to really hearing some more information to put the pieces together.
Jeff, you flagged me on this. I mean, it was out in the news, but you wanted to make it a point before we get to what I'm about to ask. Moscow PD, law enforcement in general, was taking heat. Wow, I can't believe it's been 7 weeks. What's taking? Are you proud of law enforcement? And then the question I wanted to get to that you flagged me on is, it appears that he was bullied by girls in high school. You look at photos of him in high school, he was an overweight kid. From an investigative standpoint, if you're questioning him, are you keying in on that? But first, are you proud of law enforcement?
To answer your first question, yes, I am proud of law enforcement. It's a tough job. It's not easy. And I know everyone's harping. It's been 7 weeks or so, or 7 weeks, 2 days? Just because it's been 7 weeks, 2 days, for something to this extent, that's fast. And what I mean by that is, in order to be able to get DNA and the testing back, I think our lab is labs are going to take several weeks. You have to go through all the DNA they've collected and start weaning out, okay, this is the victim's DNA, this is someone else's DNA, and then figuring out, okay, people mentioned that there was defensive wounds. Okay, so that may make it quicker to get his DNA, but still to do the DNA testing, get a DNA profile, and then to using the genealogy genetic DNA to help get a match. That's not quick. That takes a long time. That's a lot of work in the lab, and it doesn't come back like that. So everyone thinks, we're used to CSI effects of where we watch a TV show and in an hour we have a perfectly bow-wrapped case. That's not how it works in real life. And that's why I am proud, and I understand the police get beat up on it, because I've been beat up on how long it's taken me to do investigations before. To the next point, if I can add one other thing to this before I go to answer your next question, is yes, he was a criminal justice major, getting a PhD in criminology. We've touched on it. If this is the suspect, we've seen the ego associated with this person. The one thing that I think that people forget is they can go and they can get their criminal justice degree, and then they're going to know how to do everything. That's not the case. It's a lot of learning, doing on-the-job training, going to a police academy where you get training on how to do an investigation. And there's a big difference between being a book-smart person from college on criminal justice and actually being a criminal investigator. It's two totally different things. And I think we need to remind ourselves, his ego probably helped us, because he didn't take that into consideration. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. And that's what helped enable law enforcement to actually get the evidence they needed to at least make an arrest at this point. Now, to go on, I had read an article in the news where some high school friends had talked about him, and the high school friends had mentioned that they had seen him bullied in high school, and that, yes, he had in fact been bullied predominantly more by female students than male students. So I think that would go a long way to everything that Gary and Ann have talked about, things I've mentioned. And now that he's represented, I doubt he's talking. The moment at the time of the arrest, I would, again, it would go into a couple different things. One, he's going to be too smart and immediately lawyer up. Or two, he thinks he's still smarter than the investigators and will waive his rights to his attorney and his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and talk. And at that point, you want to sit there and you want to go through everything as you're interviewing him to try and start piecing together what made him tick, what made him think to get to this point, if this is the person responsible, and get an actual confession, get details that only the law enforcement investigators know what happened and the killer knew what happened. So I definitely would say that would be a big thing to do. But at this point, he is represented, and so as being a represented person, there's no more communication with him at this point.
We had Dr. Catherine Ramsland on our show a while back speaking about Dennis Rader, otherwise known as BTK, the infamous serial killer. Again, we have his daughter on the show coming up Thursday morning. It turns out she taught the suspect at DeSales University, which is in Pennsylvania. There was another woman, an adjunct professor named Michelle Bolger, and she was quoted as saying that he, meaning Brian Kohberger, was one of my best students ever. In her 10 years, she only recommended 2 students to a PhD program, calling him a great writer and a brilliant student. So, Anne, to you, is that surprising that he was one of the best students, according to this woman? And do you think he was influenced by other killers? Maybe he took a liking to Dr. Ramsland. Apparently they were close because of her connection to BTK. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, yes, he's very bright. It appears that he's bright again from all the reports that we're getting in. So, and it's an area that he's interested in. So it doesn't surprise me that he would be very good at that, and he would be able to manipulate and to come on to his professors. As a professor, you see all kinds of students, and those that want to get ahead and think in some way you can help them are going to treat you differently, and that may well have been what happened. I think you'd have to talk with both of those professors to see if indeed he acted any differently, or were they just impressed with how smart he was, or how did he write good papers, or whatever it is. I would really want to know what papers he wrote. I think that would give us a lot of insight. I'm particularly interested to see if he ever wrote on any forensic issues such as DNA or whatever. But so from that standpoint, I think that they may be very helpful in putting some pieces together. That he is, your second question about was he particularly interested in any particular killer, and I'm sure he was. Many people who work in this field will have certain killers that they are drawn to in terms of what they did or whatever. And if he was, and it sounds like if you're having Rader's daughter on, I think that's really interesting. I'll be very interested to hear what she has to say, because she obviously has more inside information than we do at this time. So I think that's great.
Thank you. Yeah, and obviously the victims' families are scarred forever. The suspect family, who did no wrong outside of having this child, they are scarred forever. Gary, to you, same question, but I'll lead in with this. He had apparently severe OCD. We had an OCD expert on the other day. He needed new pots if meat ever touched them. Does that tell you anything? And also, he had this questionnaire he developed as a master's student, almost trying to draw out answers from people about good ways to kill people. Any prevailing thoughts on that?
Well, in addition to my work in violence, I spent many years studying and writing about how severe mental illness develops, particularly psychotic disorders. And one of the interesting things about OCD is that it kind of has a bimodal distribution in when it develops in childhood or older in life. And it is very unusual to develop OCD symptoms when a person is, let's say, a late teenager or early 20s. You see that more in people who have authentic mental illness. And it is interesting to pair that with the fact that in our mass murder database, we found that people who use knives tend to have authentic mental illness. In other words, that these are people that you would find authentically odd, peculiar people, not a slick psychopath that, glides through life like a serpent and fools everybody. What's interesting about this particular person is that there seems to be a combination of features of being odd and peculiar, but also being able to mask certain parts of the self in a way that makes people trust you and kind of able to connect with you, because the reports that we have from people who knew him is that he had a very abrupt change that came in adolescence, young adulthood, with the use of drugs, particularly heroin, and then lost a lot of weight, and then suddenly became kind of a nasty, aggressive person. Now, we had said when we did the profile that this was somebody who probably, in addition to being odd, spooked people by being kind of hot-headed and a little paranoid and making strange remarks and putting people off. So that I think you start to get the image of a person who, whatever is going on with his personality, which seems to look an awful lot like people who have some kind of aberrant personality features where they hold grudges a long time or lack the same kind of moral compass or that other people generally have, is that there's also this piece that raises the question about being authentically strange and perhaps having really dealt with some kind of psychiatric thing. But the story has to come together to kind of explain how those things dovetailed with one another. What it looks like is that this is a person who developed increasingly a personality that represented the way he wanted the world to see him, who was somebody that was less ridiculed, more desirable, so forth, and then became furious that even that was not adequate, because he failed to understand that it wasn't simply that the people around him lacked taste or needed him to change to be more desirable to them. It was a problem with relating to human beings that was coming from inside the house. And so he didn't understand that whatever he did, he was still going to be odd. And it didn't matter if he turned into a supermodel, people were still going to find him odd. And I think that's a very important thing to understand when we're thinking about what would push a person like this to kind of finally say, I need to assert this one way or another. I'm going to tell the world the way I want to be seen. And I think that was a fantasy that had been brewing for a very long time. And I could both talk to you about how classic that is in the lives of a lot of offenders, that there must have been an original source, that the story had to begin with some first rejection, some first time in his life when he felt small or unattractive and all that. And I think it just kept getting reinforced and left him feeling completely out of control. And so the point is, now I'm going to assert control. One point that I keep raising when I talk about this case that I'm fascinated by is that what it looks like is that in the commission of this killing, two things happened. One was that I don't believe that this offender started on the first floor. I think he entered from an upper level, and I don't know if it was through a little window or a sliding door or whatever, but I'm very interested in the idea of a person who had once been overweight, ridiculed for being overweight and out of shape or whatever, suddenly being able to scurry like a dexterous squirrel, all over the house and slip through little openings and whatever, so that you get the idea of a person who is saying, look at me now, right? Look at what I am now. Look at what I can do now. You think I'm this and I'm really that. And then you have the element of doing it in the dark, which we talked about, where in the dark you can be whatever you want to be. And imagine having to strike people who are asleep. I mean, so that they don't even have a chance to see you, that you're a kind of a nothing that's doing this to them. So that what I really get the sense of is a person who is compensating for many years of feeling out of control and invisible. And I think if the suspect is indeed guilty, you have a very nice match with the kind of profile that we're creating here, because in this individual you saw this progression and this kind of collapse into becoming increasingly furious. And had astutely raised the point when we spoke about it previously that we don't know to what effect drugs were involved, because when drugs get involved in a mass murder, things can get a lot more frenzied. This is certainly an organized guy. I don't think it explains it, and it suggests that he was, out of control and so forth. And in fact, I think we need to emphasize that even if he really was troubled, he still had complete control over himself. This is a methodical person. Not, it would be an insult to the mentally ill to suggest that he did this out of illness or, But I think that these things were all probably contributing factors to a very odd personality. I don't know if Ann wants to say anything about the drug point, but I think it is an important one.
Well, I just think that I'm anxious to see how it comes in. We do have some information coming in public media that he did have this drug problem, even to name it, heroin, but that's only one type. There could have been others, and that it changed his personality. At least that's what we heard some of his acquaintances said. That all has to be taken into consideration, so that putting it all together, as Gary has, is I think quite important.
People write in after you guys are on. They say how much they love to listen to you. They say they could listen to Gary all day because he turns phrases like dexterous squirrels, and he's got that bass and treble in his voice. So without further ado, let's turn. We've got a boatload of questions, and your time is valuable. Let's try to get through some of these. First one comes from Karen Timmer, and I'm going to defer to the great Ann Burgess for the first one. My question is, she says, wouldn't it be likely that he, meaning the suspect, Kohberger, wrote down his thoughts and feelings after committing this crime, seeing how he was interested in these things for his studies, or possibly filled out his own questionnaire? Ann?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think he did. And in fact, if he didn't, whoever's going to be interviewing him should certainly ask them, because it would really paint quite an interesting picture. Those questions are really interesting. So as to the journal, I would think he's a pretty organized person, and he is academic or certainly used to doing that. So I would not be at all surprised that he had a journal somewhere. Certainly his hard drive. I certainly assume they would have gotten hold of his laptop or whatever, and a lot of information there, and also what sites that he would go on. That will tell a lot too.
Next question I will toss to both Gary and Jeff. It comes from Marina. She writes, he sure looks like he wants to experience himself as great. The problem is that he can't be great and innocent. So Jeff, to you first, actually, there are people out there, criminals, who think that they're going to be smarter than the collective mind of law enforcement, but you guys are pretty good at what you do. To your point, I had a profiler on yesterday who, made it a point to say he never went to college, but he had real life experience in Ontario for 31 years. And he says that you can never really outmatch the collective force of law enforcement. So curious about your thoughts, that he wanted to be perfect, but you guys, meaning law enforcement, caught him pretty quickly.
Well, again, people make mistakes. We're human, and that's what we do. So I can say in my investigations, I learned from failure. And so this is his first time doing things. If you think he can get away with doing the perfect crime where no one will ever find any evidence, especially with how technology has improved today, it's going to be tough to get away with that. I mean, he may think that. He may have all these degrees. He's book smart. He is intelligent. Everyone we've heard mention him say he's extremely intelligent, but that's your ego talking. And I think he allowed his ego to get the best of him. And even though he thought he planned everything perfectly, he didn't, because enough evidence was left behind that a probable cause was a judge signed off on a probable cause affidavit to allow law enforcement to arrest him. Now it's up to the prosecution to go further and prove that he is the person who they're alleging committed the crime.
And Gary, to you, what about this paradox that you want to be this great killer And if you are so great, you can't be caught and have the ego fed.
Well, to a certain extent, the killer didn't fail if this is indeed the person that's under arrest, because the goal, I think, was to get a lot of attention and to gain notoriety and manipulate the public, manipulate anyone to feel powerful. And as I said earlier, here we are talking about him. I mean, I don't know if it really matters if he does it from a jail cell or does it out in the world, but I think that that's a need that he's filling. And to that extent, I think he's achieved an end. I just don't think he likes that he has to achieve it in this way. But I think that need is still getting met. And, so that I shiver to think about is what would have happened if he was out in the world longer and perfected in a kind of a scientific manner how to get away with things like this, like we saw, for example, in BTK, who comes up a lot for whatever reason when we discuss BCK, this guy's initials. You wind up thinking about, like, for example, when BTK learned that it was very difficult to hold down a whole family and control them, and he didn't anticipate that one of the family members knew martial arts and things like that, right? So that he had to perfect how to control, and you see these long periods between the killings because he's sort of gearing up and getting himself ready and all of that. I think, to a point that Jeff made and Ann had also made earlier, I think he would have gotten better at it as time went on. He would have learned. He was a fledgling kind of investigator who screwed up in the first moment. But I also think what's interesting about this guy is, there's a kind of a perfectionism. And, I'm sure he's kind of sitting there saying, like, oh, like, how could I be so stupid? How can I? Because I think this is somebody that, like, wouldn't have accepted not getting like a straight A's or something like that. I think he was very regimented, very hard on himself, prided himself on, look, I may not be somebody you want to go on a date with, but I'm a hell of a lot smarter than you, that kind of thing. And those are the thoughts that come to mind when thinking about this. I think he was perfectionistic, and there is part of me that thinks that he figured if he couldn't get it in a pro-social, normal way, he was going to get it in some other way.
This is my question, and I'll throw it right back at you, Gary, and then Anne, and I'll ask Anne a follow-up. If you could interview him tomorrow, what would your first question be of him?
Well, to be honest with you, I feel that the questions that he laid out in his survey when he was at college were kind of the blueprint to what it is that he would want to be asked himself. Anne and I have a colleague, Dr. Petreka, who was able to obtain the actual questions from the survey. And one of the most fascinating things that I think he astutely pointed out was that depression is not really a risk factor for violence. But he asked a lot of questions about that kind of thing, about, like, how sad you were before the offense is what it looks like. And I think what that really speaks to is that for this person, that figured into the story. And so what I really would want to get at in an interview is the why, the motive. What was he trying to communicate? What was the way he wants to be seen if he could manipulate the narrative? What is he trying to tell the world for what he did? And I think it's very tied to the answers he would give on that survey about feeling invisible and small, and then sort of pulling the curtain away and saying, see, all of you fools were wrong. If you had given me a chance, I was a much greater than any of you realized. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. But I think that survey's the blueprint.
Oh, I absolutely do. That's where I would start. I just think that all of the questions are right there. The other thing that he did in the survey, he would ask a question about whether you would admit something. I remember one thing was, if you spilled red wine on a white rug, would you, and you're at a party, would you just put a chair over it, or would you tell the hostess that this had happened? And it was questions like that of getting away with things, how you would do it. So that certainly has to play in somehow. My question, I would like to start where I always start, is what's your very first memory? I want to know how far back he can remember, and kind of start there. Was it when he was 2, 3, 4, 5, and what was the memory, and then work it from there to get him to kind of just reminisce a bit, and not to get him anxious or fearful or whatever, which he probably will be anyway, but to get the relationship started, to get him to feel that he can talk with you.
And Ann, I mean, the $64 million question, to Gary's point, is still one word: why? Right? I mean, do you have any thoughts on motive here?
Nothing more than what Gary has said. I think we need more information to really see what he is all about. So certainly there is something about. I'm interested in the gender issue. I'm very interested to see if his lawyers are going to be male or female or both. Who's going to be asking questions? Who are they going to pick for both prosecution and defense, and what the gender will be, and to see whether he responds better or not so well with that you already mentioned that he had professors. He had 2 female professors. Was that someone who in his family was he most comfortable with, or did he identify with his mother or his father? He's got 2 sisters, as I understand it. So those kinds of things are also can add to some of the things that Gary has talked about and putting together the personality profile of him.
We'll try to get through as many of these as we can. Next one comes from CJ Feng Shui. And Gary, this is for you. This might not be the time or show to address this, but I'll ask anyway. If the person who murdered the girls does not have a mental illness, is he just pure evil?
Well, this question opens up a whole can of worms, because I've written extensively on the term evil and what people mean by it. I think when we, first of all, from a clinical perspective, it really doesn't have any value. The word evil in English is very strange that English has a word for excessive badness, that you don't really have in other languages. Comes from the Germanic ubu, which means extra or beyond or over what is necessary to, let's say, commit a crime. Right. It's the part that comes from your personality or your own cruelty that you don't need to do what you're trying to practically obtain. And I think in that sense, what you see here is what might colloquially be called evil, in the sense that there is probably no practical, instrumental kind of reason for doing this other than an expression of the self, which just happened to unfortunately involve innocent people that you've honed in on as the symbol of what it is you're playing out. But I think what the question is really getting at is this a personality thing, or is this person authentically mentally ill? And I think the problem is that some of what we call personality bleeds together too much with certain neuroatypicality and certain unusual qualities of the brain. For example, even psychopaths are emerging in research as having authentically different brains. And so that I think, what you're really saying is, when a person does things that in the vernacular we call evil, are they sick or are they just doing something out of choice? And I think even the most advanced scientists who study this would say that these are people who, despite whatever going on with their brains, still have choice. And that's very clear in the fact that this was not an impulsive thing. This is something that somebody sat around and thought about for a long time and still played out with enormous, unnecessary, over-the-top cruelty. And that's where I think personality has to be taken into consideration. And I think, let's say, it would be fair game for someone to use the word evil, because evil is a word associated with things that are where there's a forethought, that they're not impulsive, they're excessive, they're horrible, they're shocking, and they're confusing to the average individual, because most of us cannot grasp the motive in an offense like this. So I think it's fair, but I think let's let the jury be out on the contributions of authentic abnormalities and personality in this individual. If I had a bet, I would say it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B.
This next question I'll throw around the horn to each of you, a quick answer, like a sentence answer from each of you, but I thought it was interesting from Cat Toes. And Cat Toes writes, I wonder what self-care do professionals take that work with and study violent criminals. Gary mentioned you have to go deep into the recess of your mind. And they go on to be able to compartmentalize to such a degree could seem unhealthy at a certain point. But Jeff, I'll start with you. You work with violent gang members day in and day out. Do you start to see the world as a bad place with bad people? How do you separate evil from good?
That's a good question. That is actually a very good question, and it's unique. I would say one thing that it doesn't just fall under law enforcement. I would also say my mom was an emergency room nurse for 50 years, nurse in Vietnam. I spent a lot of time in the emergency room, and I've seen it with law enforcement. I've seen it with the doctors and nurses. Humor, even at the worst times, a lot of humor. And I think that can be shocking to the average person because, here we are at a crime scene. It's brutal. It's atrocious, and jokes are made. And part of that is to help you get through the horror you're seeing. When I was in Afghanistan, I responded to a suicide attack, and you're walking through human remains. You need something to help you cope with what you're seeing. And humor is one of those things that we use to help us get through that. And as you said, we do compartmentalize. You don't want to bring it home. You don't want to take it out on your wife or your kids or your spouse. If you're a woman, you're on your husband and kids, right? I'm talking as myself. I don't want to take it out on those people. So humor, and then learning, if you do have something, to talk about it. A lot of times just talking about it with someone helps you get through those horrors that you've seen.
And Jeff, thank you for your service. My mother, who went through the Holocaust, lost a child, she always says the same exact thing. Black humor has gotten her through a lot. But Anne, you have interviewed, read, been in dark places in that mind of yours. There's no one that seems more chipper and upbeat to me than you. How do you deal with it?
Well, I certainly echo the humor. I know when I was down at Quantico, the agents, they had a lot of humor. You have to. You just have to, because it can really get to you. And the other thing is, there are other things. Actually, teaching. I get a lot out of teaching because I'm hoping that what I'm seeing is transmitted onto the next generation to try to do better. I think your earlier question I was going to answer, what strikes me so much in many of these cases is how unkind people are to kids growing up, and just being nice. We just have to get to a better place in terms of treating people nicely. And I think that has, Gary writes about the social indicators that have changed since 1960, I think it is. And I think that's one of them, is just being nice and kind and gentle and so forth. It just isn't there anymore with young people growing up. I'm talking really young. I'm talking grammar school and junior high and so forth. So all of those things put together, that's what I would say. I know you want to move on here.
Now, listen to Anne and stop being a bully. Grown-ups can be bullies too. Gary, I'm assuming you escape to the movies from the posters behind your head. But how do you deal with all of this?
Well, I think that, like a surgeon or somebody working in an ambulance or so forth, I think when you're exposed repeatedly to dark things you do, I mean, even the healthiest person needs to compartmentalize. I think those of us in academia do it through intellectualization and kind of taking a kind of cerebral step back and looking at it. What I've also been very heartened by is the fact that the very thing that these offenders tend to lack, which is connections with human beings, warmth, and all of that, it helps capture them, because what it is that those of us on the other side work together in a kind of a mess. What these people are forgetting is it's not their ego against one other ego, like a chess game or something. It's their ego against an enormous world of people that are working together. I mean, for example, in this case, the general public was getting together like a giant immune system, trying to spew this guy out like a splinter, because it bothered us that he was out there and everybody wanted him discovered. And I think it's important to understand that the warm human interactions that we all have and the collaborations we have in solving these cases also goes a very long way to kind of undo the message of these people, which is that cynicism of everything is really just animal and ugly, and nobody will love you either. You're going to die alone too, that kind of thing. And the answer is no, that's not true. Even now, in this moment where we're all together, there's camaraderie, there's warmth, there's kindness, there's sharing of ideas, there's turn taking, there's feeling, important and valid and all of that. And that's a world in which these people simply can't live. They don't live. And I think that's very heartening, and it gets you through. It's realizing the meaning of your work, and that by doing it, you're collectively kind of fighting a darkness, and it's all about the victims. I mean, I think we would do this work the rest of our lives if we believed that one person could be spared from one of these kind of awful offenses, or some family could achieve relief. I think Anne and Jeff would echo that it's all about the victims, and that's what keeps you going.
Jeff, this one's for you from J. Thomas Reset. How did the white Elantra sit in front of his apartment for a month while law enforcement searched the nation for it? I presume they mean in front of Pullman, Washington.
How many white Elantras are out there, right? There's so many, and when you're getting tips, and as he said, we're getting thousands of tips, you have to go through each one, no matter how small it is. So, once they get it, now they're like, okay, they're piecing things together. But you got to remember, we don't know at what point they actually identified his white Elantra. Once the tip came out, we're looking for the white Elantra. Here they come in, right? And they're getting thousands of tips. But we don't know when they were able to identify that car. They didn't keep coming back asking for tips. So at what point? And at what point do they say, okay, this is our car? We don't know, and we won't know until we get the probable cause affidavit. So yes, okay, what was it, about week 3, or I think they started requesting a tip, or they wanted tips. So, I mean, they identified the white Elantra as a car of interest within 3 weeks. 4 weeks later, they have a suspect in custody, or less than 4 weeks later, they have a suspect in custody. That's pretty quick. So we can't just say, oh, it sat there forever. Once they start piecing things together. So it may seem to us, because we're not or to the public, they're not investigators. It may seem like it sat for a long time. We don't really know how long.
And a lot of people were talking about his mugshot. This one comes from Foot of the Mountain. What is the predictive value of staring, almost unblinking eyes and almost expressionless facial muscle tone for antisocial behavior? Is it a chronic overstimulation of norepinephrine in a fight or flight mental state of a person? Bottom line question is, I guess, is the affect, is that a common denominator among people who could potentially become serial killers? That kind of that flat, they talk about the dead eyes. Is that something that you always see?
Well, I think it depends when the photo is taken. Was that his mugshot when he's just standing there and all the lights are on him? I don't know. I don't know the context for it. But I did notice that when they had the video of his getting his diploma at school, at the school, he absolutely did not smile. And everybody else was smiling. And usually people are very happy to get a diploma. And he shook the hand of the provost, and then or president, kept on going. So he's certainly, and he's been described as deadpan. I've seen that given to him. Whether that's indicative of antisocial, I wouldn't. I'm certainly not going to say that. I just think it's that's who he is, and that really expresses a lot what Gary has said about putting together the personality, the detached.
People say he resembles Ted Bundy. Did you see that at all?
No, I don't see that at all. Not Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, remember, he lost a lot of weight so he could escape. I hope they're going to be watching him carefully.
If I may add to the mugshot, I think that what people are failing to recognize too is they're seeing the mugshot on the news, right? And there he is. He's just standing there. a mugshot, it's like a regular picture. You get told, look at the camera, turn to the right, look right, quick photograph. I mean, of course you're not going to be blinking, but we're watching the news and they have his photo up there and they're expecting movement, and it's not the case. So I've always said, I'm not one to look at the photograph. I'm more one when I'm sitting and talking to someone. So when I've talked to gang members, I talk to Al-Qaeda prisoners, Taliban prisoners, you can see in their eyes in person because it's 3D, you're sitting there. That's when you can really pick up. As Ann said, when you looked at the video, he was not smiling, he was deadpan. There's more there than a single snapshot photograph. So I think people are trying to read too much into his mugshot.
Yeah, no one looks too great in a passport photo, that's for sure. Gary, this one's for you. We'll try to bust through a few more. This one comes from Polar Bear Lab. No need for motive when someone is crazy. I think he was a serial killer fanboy, watched the Scream movies and blurred the line. OCD patients are a lot more violent than your doctor, who I had on yesterday, wanted to admit, because her patients aren't criminally insane. They just think they are. Bring on a doctor that deals with real killers, and I assure you the answer would be they are dangerous. Gary, your thoughts?
The truth of the matter is, and I've written a couple of studies that have contributed to the literature on this subject. The truth of the matter is that severely mentally ill people are not really more at risk of violence, actually more at risk of being the victims of violence. But it depends on where you're at in the time frame of the development of a condition. Because, like, for example, with psychotic disorder, as I've shown in my own work, when you first develop it and you first become convinced of, let's say, paranoid ideas, the world is against me, whatever, and you're not necessarily medicated or in treatment, there's a kind of an explosion of reaction to what you now believe that would make a person potentially more aggressive or dangerous. But then with treatment and time, people like that are not particularly likely, if they're being medicated and treated, to be violent, as long as they're not using drugs or alcohol or not adhering with treatment. And so that it's very easy to kind of say, well, people are crazy when they do things like that. What I think is much harder for us to grasp is that people who would not meet the criteria for quote unquote crazy are capable of doing things that are this awful. I think this doesn't require craziness. I think it just requires a detachment from human compassion and a kind of an ability to view a human being more like a mechanical object that you're curious about. I don't think that that's crazy. It's just distant. And now this just very quickly does get right to what I would say in response to that question about the mugshot. And I think some great points were just raised. You have to remember that about 50% of violent offenders, particularly serial killers that have psychopathic personality traits, have what are called schizoid personality traits, which is that kind of mechanical detachment. And, you know, when you think about what makes a human being seem warm and trustworthy and likable and comforting, has a lot to do with gesturing and facial expressions. The more of that, the more activated emotionally a person seems. When a person is more flat and mechanical in that restricted way, which we foresaw this offender would have, what you're going to get is people saying that this is a weird person that you can't read. When you can't read people, they seem more reptilian and kind of scary. And I think that's what people are picking up on, is that flat mechanical oddness that's sometimes in the literature called schizoid autistic detachment. This doesn't mean to indicate that people on the autism spectrum are dangerous. That's absolutely not true. But it's more the idea that that flatness can creep people out when it's present in people who also have psychopathic features and make them more prone to a mechanical approach to a body, a lot more mutilation, a lot more intellectualization of the offense. So I just wanted to kind of add that in.
And Gary, I'm really glad you brought that up, because there are reports that he may have Asperger's, and I got a flood of emails yesterday. How dare you say that Asperger's people are violent? That was not my intent. It's not what I really said. The point that was raised was, would a criminal defense attorney try to use that as a strategy to help his client? We still don't know for sure, though. whether he has Asperger's or is on the spectrum. The next question is from Chico's Mummy. This one's for Anne. Do you think he has a manifesto written down somewhere? Will he talk? Will there be an attempt by experts to try to speak to him eventually to get inside his mind?
Well, yes, of course, they're going to try to do that. We all want to get inside his mind, so to speak. So I think whoever's going to be examining him, both from defense and from prosecution, are going to get a chance to do that. And I'm very interested to see what they come up with. I think we all are.
Gary, this is a little more up your alley for sure here. This comes from a user with a lot of letters. They write, I wonder if it's possible he wanted to get caught, like a passive, very complicated suicide attempt. Maybe he enjoyed the whole process of learning about himself through study, enjoyed planning it, enjoyed doing it, perhaps very much enjoyed schooling everyone on Reddit. There were reports that he was talking a lot about the murder on Reddit. You could even see him at one point because they say he has a big know-it-all and liked to preach how smart he was personality. He was smart, but made a lot of mistakes. Could he have just had fun while it lasted, that being the intention, but figured he would lose in the end?
It's difficult to say. There are some offenders where one could make that argument, but I don't know. My sense is that there's somebody who really authentically thought that he was going to get away with this, because the rest of us are a mass of imbeciles, who don't share his shining acumen, that kind of thing. So I find that hard to believe. I do think that this is a person who cannot wait ultimately to be studied and be an object of fascination. I think he imagines that one day he'll be in, criminology textbooks and talked about in the classroom. And that's what disturbs me so much, is I imagine somebody who sat in a classroom and heard people talking about offenders and thought, one day I'll be even more interesting than that. It really gives you the shivers when you think about it. Most of us, think about I'll be the next Abraham Lincoln or something. But hearing somebody talk about an offender and that's the best you can pull off, it's pretty bad. But I think it's because he projected onto these people that they were emblems of total power, that they had control even over their own guilt. I think, when you have a person with OCD features, and we don't know, of course, that this person who's under arrest is the offender necessarily. But if he is, you have to remember that OCD would feel like an enormous impediment where you kind of hate yourself for being so anxious and weak and kind of constantly having to be worried about something, anxious about something. And then you imagine a person like that saying, look at this guy, he has no guilt at all. Like he's in total control of him, even his own conscience. And that becomes a figure of admiration and envy. It's strange, but one might even imagine the murder as being a way of saying, I've now kind of killed my own conscience. I can do anything and be in control of it and not have to be subject to an OCD kind of superego telling me all the time that I'm terrible. Right. And, it reminds me, Jeff, of a little bit of what happens when people join gangs is that they throw out the kind of conventional morality and now feel above it. And they draw power from that and a sense of security. And it's almost as if you have to prove it to the gang by like going out and killing somebody that you've thrown your super ego over, and I can't help but wonder about that mixes into this very complicated motive potentially.
Two more questions and we'll call it a wrap. This one is sort of a textbook question. Anne, to you, question to the panel. Could one of you please explain the difference between mass, serial, and spree killers, like in terms of numbers, timing, and other qualities? Anne, if you want to educate the audience on that.
Sure. Well, Gary gave a good example of it a little earlier, but the serial has changed. It used to be 3 victims, and then now it was changed back after a conference to 2. And I think Gary said why he thought that was inadequate, and I would agree. But it's 3 or more. The spree is where there is a cooling off time, so that there is one murder, one victim, a little bit of time, and then another. And the mass murder is, of course, what we have here, where all persons, 4 or more, are killed at one time.
I'm going to put these two together as one comment. The first one comes from Kerry. I believe the suspect wanted to get caught, that the murders were not his challenge. I feel he more wants the battle of wits in court. I feel his ego and arrogance will come into play then, and he believes he will walk. And then another commenter, Nancy Laporte, writes, is it possible he will try and defend himself in court, show his intelligence, and try to control the scene? Gary.
Well, it's a very difficult thing to answer briefly. I'm going to try my best. I think that there are previous offenders who are not particularly sexually motivated, or at least overtly sexually motivated, although one might read into something like stabbing with a knife or things like that as being subtly sexual. Previous cases are very instructive, right? So you think about, for example, the case of the Zodiac killer, who's never been captured, who was a master of kind of draining attention and ego satisfaction out of everything all the time. And in that case, what you saw was somebody who figured out that he didn't even have to kill, because he could take credit for any unsolved offense that happened out there, and kind of make you wonder if he had brilliantly disguised it as what looked like a random robbery or something like that, right? That went haywire and there was a shooting, and then he would take credit. And I think what these ego-driven people are about is that the killing almost becomes, I mean, it can be an expression of ego, but technically speaking, they can get the ego satisfied in other ways. And that's why I think that there's a person that even incarcerated would find ways to satisfy that need, whether it's being the object of attention with people writing him letters, or having, fan club, very unfortunately, of people who put him in some twisted pedestal, or cases of hybristophilia, where somebody falls in love with you because you're a criminal, which unfortunately does happen, or somebody who is manipulating the police or messing with the public's understanding of the crime. I think that I hate to say it, but the murder was just one form of expression of that need. And I think what we're going to see over time as the story emerges is somebody who found many different ways to play that out. It was totally pervasive, from holding a grudge, making nasty comments to people, condescending to people, being the best person in the class, the all of us sitting around talking about him right now, etc. I just think it's going to be a constant assertion of ego. So there's a highly narcissistic, self-absorbed component to this individual that found its satisfaction there. And for other people, it needs more an expression in sexual hostility or sadism or other things. But here, I think the core of this person is much more about, look at me, I'm fascinating. Right.
Jeff.
I was going to say, having a defendant at one point who actually began to try and defend himself and seeing this, we've seen that this person is extremely intelligent. He was in criminology. That's not, he didn't study, he didn't go to law school, he hasn't passed the bar. Not saying he couldn't, I'm sure he could. He seems to be intelligent enough to do very well. However, based on his intelligence that we've seen, I think he would realize that in a court of law, not knowing how to ask the proper questions and go through the proper procedures that an attorney would do, he has enough intelligence to realize he could not defend himself, because he would make too many mistakes and he wouldn't want to do that.
We'll take a final comment to Anne, and then quick closing remarks. This one comes from Rain Walker. The final comment of this episode: what motivated him is plain from his study, psychology. He wanted true life experiential answers to the questions on his survey. The victims were easy marks. And you buy that?
Well, I buy that any victim who's in bed sleeping and the killer can get in, that's an easy victim, of course, because they're very vulnerable. But the matter of whether he planned it, does he feel that inadequate that he has to pick that type of a victim? I was always struck with, there were 6 persons in that house, and he does get to 4 of them, but not to the other 2. So that's going to be important to see why 2 were left and not injured. But I just still see this as a very well planned. For some reason, there has to why he picked these particularly 4. If there was one targeted, they keep telling us that there was somebody targeted, so they must have some information that they won't release until Wednesday or whenever they open the affidavit. But I just see it as an organized crime. He had plenty of time to get away. That was the other thing that worked to his advantage. So how well he had that in his mind, I don't know. What if somebody had come in? I mean, there are a lot of ifs, what if, that didn't happen, and he got away with it for 7 weeks.
My dog barking in the background knows it's time to wrap things up. The man with a flag behind him is Jeff Wood, retired FBI special agent out of Boston who served his nation and then came and took care of gang violence. Jeff, where do we go from here from an investigative standpoint?
Well, investigators, as they've said on the news, will continue to try and paint the entire picture of when he started to target them, as we've been led to believe in the news, all the way up until they captured, they made an arrest. If this is in fact the person they believe, which I'm guessing based on the fact that they got a probable cause warrant, they believe he is responsible. So they'll be interviewing lots of people. They're going to be interviewing neighbors, interviewing anyone, friends of the victims, to paint that picture of this is how they met, if they've met. Because as both Ann and Gary said, he picked them for a reason, or picked somebody in that house for a reason. And they want to be able to paint that picture of why them, when did it start, how, the whole, the 5 W's in the how, who, what, when, where, why, how is what they're going to want to present to a jury to say, this is the story so we can get a conviction.
Dr. Gary Brucato is a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Ann Burgess. He studies, among other things, how violent thoughts and actions emerge in psychotic versus non-psychotic persons, and is the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime. Gary, final thought.
Well, I guess what I would just like to say at the end here is that, just to, as we hover on this offender who would love for us to have not, do nothing but sit around and talk about him, I think it's a nice thing to an important thing to pause and think about the victims. Which I think is a very important point to always close on, that these were innocent people who were somebody's kids and somebody's classmates and friends and grandkids and so forth, who were just sort of plucked out of the world because of somebody's fantasies about them or about other people that have been projected onto them. And I think it's also important to, at the end, to say, let's not stigmatize the mentally ill. That when you're dealing with aberrant kind of personalities that do awful things, don't lump them in with people who are really suffering from mental illness. So I think it's a good place to for me to end, is to draw it back to them, and they're the reason we do this work, not because we're fascinated by the killers.
Very, very nicely said. And Wolbert Burgess is an internationally recognized pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse. She is the author of A Killer by Design, Murders, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. And speaking of the Netflix show Mindhunters, it is loosely based on Ann's work with the FBI. Ann, your final thoughts.
Well, my final thoughts, I would echo what Gary has just said, and Jeff, in terms of the victims and the families of the victims. And there is another family now that we have with the arrest of this particular person, and that's his family. And that is not easy, I don't think, for them to have to deal with this. I do see that they did make a statement today that was read out on the news, and that they are supporting him, and obviously think that he's going to prove his innocence. I think that was what was said. So we need to also consider that and to keep an open mind as we follow this whole case. It is very instructive. I think that there's a lot to be learned by this, and I am glad that you're doing this, keeping this in our uppermost in our thoughts, because there is a lot to learn from this particular case. And I thank you very much for inviting us back.
Wow, thank you for coming back. To that point, again, a programming note, Wednesday morning, we have Barbara Ray Venter, who helped crack the Golden State Killer. She is a world-renowned expert in genealogical DNA. And I'm going to put Ann and Gary on the spot right now. On Wednesday night, we'll be doing an interview with Kerry Ross and BTK's daughter. And you guys have first dibs. If you'd like to join us for that, I would love to have you. You guys could ask her a lot more compelling questions than I ever could, so we can discuss that offline. But all of you out there in STS Nation, do not worry. We'll be back with another episode of Surviving the Survivor. Love you, America.